Have you ever imagined how low a person can go when addiction takes over their life? For many families, the drama of addiction is real, painful, and full of twists and turns that few can overcome. In the case of Josh, a father who seemed to have everything under control, the situation reached the point of stealing his own son to fuel his bad choices. That's right. He stole his son Cameron's iPad, a talented and hopeful boy, just to try to pay off a debt he created. Who would have thought that a father, in despair, would reach this point? But here's what no one tells you. Life always gives you second chances. The big question is, will you waste it or hold on to it with all your might? What would you do if you had the opportunity to redeem yourself and regain the respect of those you love? This story of overcoming and inspiration will show you that, even in the midst of chaos, it is possible to find humility and the strength necessary to change. How about signing up right now and being part of our community? By clicking the subscribe button, you not only help us bring you more stories like Josh's, but you also ensure you don't miss any of our inspiring videos. Come with us to discover how, even in the most difficult times, it is possible to get back on your feet and transform your life. Sign up and activate the bell so you don't miss anything. Josh walked through the deserted streets, the cold of the night penetrating his skin, but not as much as the anxiety that throbbed in his mind. He knew he was being followed. He felt the pressure on every step. Suddenly, sirens broke the silence. Blue light flashed off the windows of closed stores. When the police car stopped next to him, Josh turned around, his hands raised, as if he had already expected it. That moment of drama froze time. "It's just a misunderstanding," he said, trying to hide his despair. But deep down, even he knew this wasn't the first time. The pattern repeated itself, and there he was, trapped between the desire to overcome and the addiction that dominated him. The police handcuffed him without ceremony, as if they already knew the story. As he was placed in the car, flashes of his life flashed before his eyes. Every mistake, every poorly thought-out choice had led him here. Josh wanted to believe that a turnaround was possible, that this was all just a chapter in his personal drama. But with each arrest, that hope faded a little more. He looked out the window, watching the city lights disappear as the police car drove away. Was it too late to redeem himself? Inside the police station, the atmosphere was cold and impersonal. Josh tried not to look at the other detainees, but the weight of his own guilt was suffocating him. The police officer filling out the paperwork barely looked at him. For the system, he was just another number, another one that got lost along the way. He remembered the promises he made to himself. "I'm going to change. I'm going to be someone better." But how many times had he said this? It was difficult to keep faith when reality hit so hard. His mind wandered between frustration and the desire to find inspiration, something that would motivate him to break out of that cycle. As he waited, he looked at the cracks in the walls of the detention room. It seemed like a reflection of his own life. Cracks everywhere, weaknesses he had never been able to fix. Josh thought about Cameron, his son, and how much he had failed him. The tears almost came, but he held them back. There was no room for weakness there. Perhaps this prison was his last chance to overcome, but he knew that, to do so, he needed to face his own demons. The path would be long and painful, but it was the only one left. Across town, Cameron was probably finishing up developing his app, proud of his work, while Josh was locked up again. The contrast between their lives could not be greater. The son, full of dreams and ambition, while the father seemed to sink deeper and deeper into his own abyss. Guilt gnawed at Josh, but he wondered if he had the courage to do anything about it. He knew that if there wasn't a turnaround, he would lose everything for good, including Cameron's respect. When the cell door closed behind Josh, the sound echoed as a reminder of his choices. "This is all temporary," he thought, trying to hold on to any ray of hope. But the truth was, he had heard this before. The humiliation of being there, surrounded by others who were also on the brink, made him question his own strength. The drama of his life no longer seemed like a movie, but a sad reality that he had created for himself. Still, deep down, a voice whispered, "You can change, but you have to really want to." A few hours passed, and Josh was taken to an interrogation room. The bright light on his face momentarily blinded him, but he remained calm. The police officer in front of him stared at him, as if he was waiting for a confession. But what else could he say? He had tried to explain himself before, but reality was relentless. "You need help, Josh," the officer said, in a voice that sounded almost compassionate. That hit Josh like a punch in the gut. Yes, he needed help, but where would it come from? As the minutes dragged by, Josh began to think about his family, about the people he had hurt along the way. If you could go back in time, would you do everything differently? It was easy to think about comebacks when you were at rock bottom. He imagined a future where he would be a present father to Cameron, where his life would finally take the right path. But that future seemed as distant as the stars shining outside. All he had at that moment was uncertainty. As Josh was taken back to his cell, he allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. Maybe that prison was the turning point he so needed. Sometimes the greatest lessons come from the worst moments, and maybe this was one of those. He knew that, for there to be overcoming, there needed to be suffering. But was he ready for the sacrifice it would require? Life has never been easy for him, but perhaps it was time to face the challenges head on. What else did he have to lose? Dawn approached, and Josh tried to sleep amidst the chaos of his thoughts. He knew his life was in pieces, but there was something inside him, a small spark of hope that refused to go out. Tomorrow will be a new day, he thought. But would tomorrow bring answers? Would Cameron understand the drama his father was going through? Josh's life was at a crossroads, and the choice between remaining in the abyss or seeking redemption was increasingly clear. He just needed to take the first step. While Josh was facing his own demons, Cameron, his son, was at home, completely immersed in his project. He had spent the last few weeks developing an app for his basketball team, something he was proud of. The tablet's bright screen was like a window into a world where he had control, where he could create, innovate, and excel. But deep down, Cameron knew this project wasn't just about technology or basketball. It was a way to get his father's attention, to show that he also had something important to offer. The sadness came along with the feeling of being ignored. Every line of code Cameron wrote was a silent reminder of his loneliness. He wondered why his father, who used to be so present, now seemed so distant. The app was more than a simple programming project. It was a silent cry for attention. When he presented the progress to Josh, he received a brief smile and empty praise. Josh was physically there, but his mind wandered elsewhere. Cameron wanted his father to be there, not just in body but in spirit, rooting for him, the same way he rooted for his team. At school, Cameron was known as the programming whiz kid, which made him feel a mixture of pride and pressure. The app he was creating would not only allow the team to track their stats, but it would also help fans connect with the game in a new, interactive way. He knew he was doing something amazing, but the only person whose opinion really mattered didn't seem to care that much. Every time Josh dodged her questions about the app, Cameron felt a silent pain, a mix of disappointment and frustration. At home, while working on the code, Cameron often remembered the stories Josh used to tell about his own dreams. His father spoke passionately about being a screenwriter, about how he wanted to change the world with his stories. But those stories now seemed as distant as the stars. Cameron wondered if his father would ever dream again. The app he was building was a way of saying, "Dad, I have dreams too. I want to be someone too." But as time passed, that message seemed to go unheard. What Cameron didn't know was that Josh, in the midst of his internal battles, felt a deep shame about his inability to be there for his son. He knew Cameron was talented. He knew the boy had a brilliant mind and a promising future. But at the same time, Josh felt unable to support this. His addiction, his debts, everything seemed like an insurmountable obstacle. He wanted to be there for his son. He wanted to be the father Cameron deserved, but at the same time, he was stuck in the cycle of self-destruction. This created a tension that grew every day. Cameron, unaware of his father's internal battles, remained focused on his project, determined to make it work. He saw the app as a metaphor for his own life. If he could organize the code, create the right connections, and iron out the bugs, maybe he could repair his relationship with his father, too. But bugs in the code were much easier to fix than familiar problems. Each night, when he looked at the bedroom door, waiting for Josh to come in to see his progress. He only heard silence. One night, Cameron decided he would present the app to his father, a sort of last-ditch attempt to reconnect. He prepared meticulously, reviewing every feature, testing the app countless times. When Josh finally got home, Cameron was waiting with his tablet in hand, ready to show off the results of weeks of work. "Dad, look what I did," he said, with hope in his eyes. But the answer was once again vague and disinterested. "Cool, son. I'll look into that later." Cameron smiled, but inside, he felt defeated. Over the next few days, Cameron continued working on the app, but the motivation he had in the beginning was starting to fade. He wondered if it was worth continuing to try so hard. If his own father, the person he most wanted to impress, didn't care, why would the rest of the world care? He knew his work was good, but without Josh's support, everything felt empty. The project that once represented overcoming and inspiration now became a burden, a constant reminder of what he didn't have. But something inside Cameron refused to give up. He knew he was creating something special, something that could help his team and his friends. He decided that even if his father wasn't there, he would still be proud of himself. And who knows, maybe one day Josh would look back and see what he had lost. Cameron's humility, his desire to be recognized by his father, was something he kept within himself. He knew that life doesn't always give us the answers we want, but that didn't mean we should stop trying. The cycle between father and son continued, with Cameron seeking connection and Josh fighting his own ghosts. The application was almost ready, but the relationship between the two was still far from fixed. Cameron believed that, over time, things could change. Maybe, just as he fixed the bugs in the app, he could also fix his relationship with Josh. But this would require time, patience, and, above all, the willingness of both to try. And through it all, Cameron hoped with a sinking heart that his father would realize the importance of being there before it was too late. Josh felt the weight of debt crushing his shoulders. Each day felt like a race against time, a struggle to keep up appearances while her life crumbled inside. Addiction had pushed him to a point of no return, where every wrong choice pushed him deeper. He could no longer hide his situation. The late rent, the bills that piled up, and the constant threats from Reggie, the collector who didn't accept excuses. "You have until tomorrow," was what Reggie said last time. The phrase echoed in Josh's mind like an imminent death sentence. Every encounter with Reggie was a cruel reminder of the hole Josh had dug for himself. Reggie was not a man of patience, and with each visit, the threats became clearer. Josh knew he couldn't run away forever. He wanted to believe that there would be a turnaround, that somehow, miraculously, he would get the money in time. But reality was relentless. He had nowhere to get the amount he owed, and the constant fear of what might happen if he didn't pay was eating him up inside. Josh's addiction had sent him into a spiral of bad decisions. The money he got almost always ended up being spent on substances that kept him numb, away from the problems that surrounded him. But the escape was temporary, and soon the burden of debt returned with full force. He looked around his house, trying to find something of value to sell. Every object he owned felt like a reminder of a time when things were simpler, when he still had control over his life. Reggie's charges grew more threatening by the day. "If you don't pay, you'll regret it," he repeated, his voice cold as steel. Josh knew those weren't empty words. Reggie had dangerous connections, and he had no doubt the threat was real. The fear of being hurt or worse was constant, but at the same time, Josh wondered what else he had to lose. His family was already distant, his professional life in ruins. Maybe, he thought, the end of the line was just a matter of time. Josh tried to maintain a facade of normalcy when he was with Cameron, but the stress showed in every conversation, in every gesture. Cameron was smart. He knew something was wrong, but he didn't know the extent of the problem. Josh found himself deeper and deeper into debt, and the only way out he saw was temporary. Another loan, another postponement of collection. But he knew that this was just pushing the problem forward, and that the time to pay the bill was coming too quickly. With each passing day, the pressure increased. Josh was beginning to lose his ability to think clearly. He thought about asking for help, but shame and pride stopped him. How could he admit to the few people left in his life that he had sunk so low? He imagined Cameron discovering the truth and felt his stomach turn. It was a mixture of humiliation and despair, as if he was on the edge of an abyss and didn't know how to step back. In a moment of desperation, Josh began thinking about more extreme options. He knew he couldn't continue living like this. His mind wandered to dark scenarios, but at the same time, a part of him still clung to hope. Maybe, somehow, he could overcome this. Maybe there was a way out that he didn't yet see. But these ideas were fleeting, quickly disappearing under the weight of reality. The debt didn't wait, and Reggie was merciless. Time was against him, and he knew it. Josh started avoiding Reggie's calls, but that only made the situation worse. Every message left, every unanswered ring, was a reminder of the impending disaster. He knew that he would eventually have to face the consequences. Reggie wasn't the type to accept excuses or delays. With each new encounter with him, the tone became more aggressive. Josh was starting to realize he was running out of options. Debt imprisoned him, and he felt that the only way out was a desperate act. When the deadline arrived, Josh felt like the world was falling apart around him. He knew he didn't have the money, and he knew Reggie wouldn't accept any more excuses. The clock was ticking, and every second that passed increased the pressure on his mind. He wondered how he had gotten to this point, how he had allowed his life to deteriorate so much. The debt was just a symptom of a bigger problem, something he didn't yet know how to fix. But now, he no longer had time to reflect. That night, Josh found himself at a crossroads. He knew the next step would be decisive. Paying the debt was impossible, but escaping the consequences also seemed out of the question. He needed a way out. But what would it be? Reggie's words kept echoing in his mind. If you don't pay, you'll regret it. Josh's life was on the verge of a new twist, and the next step he took would define his future, for better or for worse. But he still didn't know which path to choose. At work, Josh always seemed to be on edge. Every little detail irritated him, and the stress of his personal life spilled over into his daily interactions. He knew his job was one of the few things he had left in his life, but at the same time, he felt like he couldn't take it anymore. The routine, demanding clients, and the feeling of being trapped in an endless cycle consumed him. He tried to remain calm, but more and more he lost control. His co-workers noticed his impatience, but few dared to confront him. Josh's relationship with clients was also deteriorating. Before, he was able to handle demands calmly, but now, any complaint felt like a personal attack. On that particular day, a customer arrived complaining about a product she purchased. Josh, already tired and frustrated, could barely contain his irritation. "It's your problem, not mine," he grumbled, without thinking about the consequences. The woman was surprised by the response and asked to speak to the manager, but Josh was already beyond the point of return. The manager called him in for a chat. Josh knew he would be warned, but instead of admitting his mistake, he reacted defensively. "I don't need this job anyway," he shouted, standing up abruptly. The room fell silent. The manager looked at him with a mixture of surprise and disappointment. Josh knew he was making an impulsive decision, but in the heat of the moment, he felt like he had no choice. He left the room without looking back, as if he was running away not just from his job, but from everything that kept him trapped there. The drama at work reflected Josh's internal chaos. He couldn't handle the pressure, and every day felt like a losing battle. The feeling of being stuck in a job that didn't satisfy him only increased his frustration. Instead of seeing work as an opportunity, he saw it as a prison. With each rude customer, each endless shift, he felt the weight of failure on his shoulders. The feeling of defeat was constant, and he wondered if one day there would be a way out of this downward spiral. Josh's finances were directly tied to that job, and by leaving so abruptly, he knew he was creating another problem for himself. Without a source of income, your debts would become even more unbearable. But at the time, he couldn't think clearly. His mind was clouded, oppressed by the feeling of failure and the need to escape any situation that would bring him face to face with his mistakes. Josh felt trapped, unable to make rational decisions. When he got off work that day, Josh walked the streets aimlessly, trying to process what had just happened. He knew that by leaving his job, he had sealed his fate. The chances of repaying his debt to Reggie were gone, and now he would have to deal with the consequences. He wanted to scream. He wanted to blame the world for everything that was happening. But deep down, he knew he was the only one responsible. With each step, the weight of his decisions seemed to grow stronger, pressing down on him from every direction. Josh remembered how, years ago, he was a dedicated employee. He liked what he did, or at least, he could handle it. But addiction had changed everything. What was once tolerable now became unbearable. He could no longer see the value in his work, and each day seemed like an insurmountable challenge. He was beginning to lose control over his own life, and his job, which had once been an anchor, now felt like a stone tied around his neck, plunging him deeper into chaos. That night, Josh tried to justify his decision. "I was unhappy in that place," he said to himself. But deep down, he knew that the decision to quit his job wasn't just about the job. It was about his inability to deal with the problems he had created himself. The job was just another aspect of his life that was falling apart. Frustration, despair, and addiction mixed together, creating a perfect storm that he couldn't control. He knew that sooner or later he would have to face reality. Even after quitting his job, the weight of guilt wouldn't leave him alone. He knew he had acted on impulse, and now the consequences were about to knock on his door. Reggie wouldn't accept any more excuses, and Josh didn't know how to get out of this situation. Every decision he made seemed to push him further into the abyss, and he began to realize he was running out of options. The drama of his life was about to reach a new level of intensity, and he didn't know if he was ready for it. As he walked back home, Josh tried to think of a solution, but his mind was in a whirlwind of confusing thoughts. He knew he needed help, but he didn't know where to start. Pride prevented him from asking for help, and fear paralyzed him. But deep down, he knew he couldn't go on like this. Life was presenting him with a difficult choice, and he would have to decide whether he would face his problems head-on or continue running away from them, as he had done until then. When Josh entered the house that night, the darkness seemed thicker than usual. Cameron was already asleep, and the silence that enveloped the house weighed heavily on his shoulders. He knew what he needed to do, but the guilt was already starting to eat away at his mind before he even acted. Cameron's tablet was there, on the table, as a reminder of his son's talent and dedication. Josh knew how much that object meant to him, but at the same time, he felt a growing despair over the debt he needed to pay. The internal conflict was suffocating. With silent steps, Josh took the tablet in his hands, feeling the weight of the decision. He looked at the screen, where Cameron had left the basketball app project open. The pride his son felt in his work was evident, and for a moment, Josh almost gave up. But need, addiction, and the pressure of debt spoke louder. He knew that if he didn't get the money soon, the situation with Reggie would get irreversibly worse. The image of Cameron smiling while showing his progress on the app flashed through Josh's mind, bringing a pang to his heart. As he left the house, taking the tablet with him, Josh tried to justify his action. "It's temporary," he told himself. "I'll pay him back and buy him another one." But deep down, he knew this was a lie. Increasingly, their promises of change and overcoming became empty. The reality was that he was sacrificing his own son's well-being to fuel a cycle of self-destruction. The idea that the tablet could be sold for a fraction of what Cameron had put into it made Josh's stomach turn. Deep down, he knew that this decision would have profound consequences. The tablet was more than just an electronic device for Cameron. It was the fruit of his labor, a symbol of his talent, and his effort to build something of value. But for Josh, at that moment, the tablet was nothing more than a quick way to get money to pay off his debt. The selflessness he so wished he had as a father was buried beneath layers of addiction and despair. He couldn't see any other way out. Josh went to an acquaintance who was buying used electronics, already deciding to sell the tablet. When he handed the device to the man, a feeling of defeat took over his being. He knew he was betraying his son. He knew he was going against everything Cameron believed in. The money he received in return seemed like a joke, a paltry amount compared to what that tablet represented for the boy. But for Josh, at that moment, it was enough to postpone Reggie's threats for another day. Upon returning home, Josh felt the emptiness growing inside him. He looked at the table where the tablet used to sit, and for a moment, imagined Cameron's reaction when he found out what had happened. He knew that his son's trust was at stake, and that this type of betrayal would be difficult to repair. But at the same time, he convinced himself that he had no other choice. The drama of his life seemed to have no end, and each wrong decision took him deeper into the hole he was trapped in. The next day, Cameron woke up excited to continue working on his app, but when he looked for the tablet, it was nowhere to be found. Confusion soon gave way to concern, and he began searching the house, trying to understand what had happened. When he asked his father, Josh hesitated. I needed to resolve something, he said, avoiding his son's gaze. The disappointment was immediate in Cameron's eyes. He knew something was wrong, but he still tried to believe that his father would have a better explanation. She never came. The silence that hovered between the two was unbearable. Cameron knew his father was lying, but he didn't have the strength to confront him. Sadness overwhelmed him, and he locked himself in his room, trying to process what had happened. The tablet, which was so important to him, simply disappeared. And more than the object, what really hurt was the loss of trust. His father, who he always tried to support, had once again chosen the wrong path. Cameron's hope was beginning to fade. Josh, in turn, felt increasingly guilty. He knew he had crossed a line that perhaps could not be undone. Cameron's tablet was a bridge between the two, and now it was broken. He wanted to believe that he could still make things right, that one day he could explain to his son what led him to make this decision. But deep down, he knew that, with each mistake, this explanation became more difficult to give. Regret was a constant shadow in his mind. And so, the distance between father and son increased. Josh tried to pretend things could go back to normal, but he knew Cameron's trust was shattered. The tablet was just a symbol, but the stakes were much greater. For Cameron, this meant more than losing an object. It was confirmation that his father was moving further and further away, always choosing the easiest path, the path of escape. And now, Josh would have to deal with the consequences of that choice once again. Despite all the wrong choices, something inside Josh began to change. Maybe it was Cameron's blank stare or the memory of the days when he still had his son's trust. Josh began to realize that life was offering him one last chance, a second chance that many wouldn't have. He looked in the mirror, trying to recognize himself, and wondered how he got there. That man, marked by addiction and hopelessness, was not who he wanted to be. Was there still time for a turnaround? He wasn't sure, but he was willing to try. The feeling that I was on the edge of making a definitive choice grew every day. Josh knew the path to destruction lay ahead of him. Easy to follow, familiar. But for the first time in a long time, he began to glimpse the possibility of something different. Cameron deserved better, and he, Josh, knew he needed to be better. That moment of clarity, although brief, seemed to bring a little light to his darkness. But the challenge of change was not just about momentary decisions. It was about real commitment, something Josh always had trouble keeping. When Cameron talked about the upcoming basketball game, Josh felt a twinge of hope. He had promised countless times to attend the games, but he always failed. This time, he wanted it to be different. "I will, son," he said, trying to convey a confidence he himself didn't feel. Cameron looked at him suspiciously, but still, something inside him wanted to believe. For Josh, this was more than just a promise. It was a commitment to change, to overcoming everything that prevented him from being a present father. The day of the game arrived, and Josh, against all expectations, appeared on the court. Cameron was surprised, almost in disbelief. It was the first time in a long time that Josh had kept a promise, and it generated a mix of emotions in the boy. The father's presence, even if late, was an important step towards reconnection between them. Josh sat in the stands, watching his son play. He saw Cameron's passion and dedication, and it made him reflect on everything he had missed over the years. As he watched the game, Josh thought about how life had given him more chances than he deserved. The car accident, the overdoses, all the situations where he could have died. But somehow he was still there. He wondered why he kept getting these second chances, and for the first time, he began to see the purpose behind them. Maybe life was showing him that there was still time to fix things. Cameron was his biggest motivation, and he knew that if he wanted to regain his son's trust, he would need to do much more than just showing up to a game. After the game, Cameron approached Josh, tired but happy to see his father there. Josh smiled, trying to show that this time he was really there. "You played well," he said, with a sincerity Cameron hadn't expected. The boy thanked him, still suspicious, but deep down, he wanted to believe that his father was changing. For Josh, that moment was a small victory, but he knew there was still a long way to go. It was the first step of many, and he was determined not to waste this chance. Over the next few days, Josh began taking concrete steps to redeem himself. He knew he needed help and sought out an addiction support group. At the first meeting, he felt uncomfortable, as if he didn't belong there. But as he heard other people's stories, Josh realized he wasn't alone. Everyone there was looking for a second chance, a way to overcome their mistakes and move forward. The humility of admitting that he needed help was a big step for him, and it made him see that change was possible. Meanwhile, Cameron continued to watch his father from a distance. He wanted to believe that Josh was changing, but he didn't know if he could completely trust it. The broken promises from before were still fresh in his mind, and the scar of the betrayal with the tablet still hurt. However, Cameron didn't want to give up hope. He knew his father was capable of being better, but it would take time. With each small gesture Josh made, with each effort to be present, Cameron began to see a small spark of hope. But would it be enough? Josh began to become more involved in Cameron's life, trying to make up for lost time. He knew he couldn't just erase all the mistakes, but he was willing to fight to win his son back. They started spending more time together, talking about Cameron's app, about basketball, about anything that connected them. Josh wanted Cameron to know that this time, he was committed, and although the path was long, he was finally willing to walk it. Life continued to test Josh, but this time, he felt he was more prepared. The journey of overcoming was full of obstacles, and he knew he would fall at times. But unlike before, he was no longer alone. Cameron, little by little, began to trust his father again, and this gave Josh the strength he needed to continue. The second chance life gave him would not be wasted, and this time, he would do everything he could to make Cameron see the man he could become. So, what are you going to do with the second chances that life offers you? Josh had to lose almost everything to realize the value of what really matters. But you don't have to wait until you hit rock bottom to change. The truth is that transformation begins with small choices in daily attitudes. Think about who you want to be. Think about the people around you who depend on you. It's time to act and not wait for change to come from outside. What would you do if you knew you could regain the respect and love of those around you? Are you willing to pay the price of change? Don't let time pass and steal the opportunities that life gives you. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and keep learning how to change your story for the better. Because, in the end, the person most responsible for your transformation is you.